Hello, Raptors fans. Welcome to the second installment of the Toronto Raptors draft analysis with Raptors Report. Today, I have back on the show none other than Sam, aka at Hoop Goose on Twitter. We had him on last time. It went great. He's back. We're going to be talking about the Toronto Raptors draft picks. Sam, welcome back.
Glad to be back.
Yeah, so we have a lot to discuss here. Two picks, because the Toronto Raptors picked at both of their spots. There were no trades. I think that we kind of forecasted this in the last podcast that we did. We said that we don't expect the Raptors to make any big deals. We did discuss it, but we didn't expect them to do anything crazy, and they didn't. They picked at number 29, which is kind of what we expected. What we didn't expect were the personnel, the people that the Toronto Raptors drafted. But I think, to be fair to us, I don't think anybody really projected the Raptors picking who they picked. Why don't we jump in and talk about the 29th pick, Malachi Flynn, who he is, what his accomplishments are. I'll give a very brief intro. He's a 22-year-old point guard from San Diego State. He's 6'1". But other than that, I'm going to let Sam, I'm going to throw it over to you and let you sort of discuss kind of who he is, what his background is, all of the pertinent details.
Yeah, okay. So most people should know by now that we drafted Malachi Flynn. And he's a point guard out of San Diego. So just looking at him, he's a versatile guy. So he's kind of one of those do-it-all point guards that the Raptors really love. You see comparisons to like Fred or maybe even Kyle, but I think that one's kind of too out there.
Kyle Lowry's a very unique talent.
I think he's just straight up a Hall of Fame player. So I don't think it's fair to compare anyone to him, really. Kyle Lowry is just Kyle Lowry.
Absolutely. So what they got here is an older guy, a guard who had lots of success in college. He was good statistically, good defensively, as you mentioned, maybe kind of very similar to Fred VanVleet.
The only thing here that kind of surprised me was that everything else kind of fits the Raptors' profile of not caring about age and valuing production and stuff like that. It's just Flynn is, I think, the first guy that they've drafted that is like below average in terms of like athleticism and like length and stuff like that, which is why I didn't really consider him the last time. So it surprised me that they went with him, but I can see why.
Are you saying that maybe Malachi Flynn is maybe a little more limited in terms of what he can do? Like, let's use Fred as a baseline. Would you say that, how close are they athletically?
I think they're pretty different athletes. Like Flynn is like a little quicker than Fred, I would say, but Fred is like much stronger. So that affects how they play. So I think that makes Fred more switchable on defense, for example. He can play up to like, sometimes you can put him on a small forward. I don't think you'll be able to do that with Flynn. On offense, Fred is, he's not as like quick as Flynn is, but he can push other guards out of the way when he gets to the rim.
Right, create space. And we see that on his, step back attempts and things like that. He puts his body into guys and then he pulls back and pops it. So maybe we can talk a little bit about the Raptors drafting strategy, because it was, I think, on display for both of the picks that they made a couple nights ago. With both of their picks, they've done this in recent drafts, in not only this draft but other drafts as well, which is draft older guys. High floor guys where you can maybe project their futures in the NBA a little bit more clearly than others. Do you think that this is an emergent strategy, like they're picking guys they believe are undervalued? Or do you think it's a conscious decision on their part where they're picking older guys because they think they're a better culture fit, or maybe they're more equipped to deal with the Raptors systems, things like that? What would you say?
It might just be all of that. Like, I'm sure they consider everything when looking at a prospect. So when you have these older guys, you have more background of them to research. they're a little bit more defined in who they are as a player, and probably more mature on average as well. And yeah, you're right that they're usually undervalued because the NBA still doesn't like to draft older guys.
I've noticed that, but probably one of the best examples of a guy that, has had higher upside than people assumed was, the guy they just signed, Fred VanVleet. One of the reasons he went undrafted was because he was older and had those size concerns. But the Raptors just kind of looked past that and saw a guy that they felt could contribute to their squad. And then you got to give not just credit to the Toronto Raptors organization for finding him, but also to Fred VanVleet, who, developed himself into a guy who earns $21 million a season.
Yeah, you can see it with Fred. Last year, we saw it with Brandon Clark on the Grizzlies, or even Pascal Siakam, who fell for similar reasons.
Right, absolutely. So, Jonathan Givony, formerly of Draft Express, now of ESPN, mentioned that guards were underdrafted in this draft, with forwards and, weirdly, bigs going early. Do you think the Raptors kind of zigged while everyone else zagged?
I think that played a part in it, but I'm someone who was lower on the bigs in this class than most people. Like, when Jalen Smith got drafted number 10, I was pretty surprised. But I think it's a direct reaction to the playoffs, which usually happens every year. We saw a big team like the Lakers and win a title. We saw the Nuggets go deep into the playoffs. So I think NBA teams are pretty reactive, like copycats. So they saw these big men, and I think they just reacted to that and decided to reach a little.
And even though a lot of guards slipped in the draft, as we mentioned, do you think that there's a reason that the Raptors keyed in on Malachi Flynn over maybe some of the other guards that were available?
I think what they like about Flynn compared to what we already have is that he has a nice pick and roll game, and he can shoot, he can play off ball, on ball, and he really fits as a culture piece on the Raptors. So he's the exact kind of personality they always go for. So I don't know if you want me to talk about Theo, but it's pretty similar, but more raw. Why don't we talk about
Theo? Because we mentioned him last time. If this is your first time listening to this podcast, we did mention Theo Maledon as a guy that the Raptors might be interested in. I know you, Sam, were a big fan of his, but the Raptors decided to go in another direction. Maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, they did end up working out Theo after we recorded the last one. So that had me pretty positive, but they chose not to draft him. Obviously, I can't tell you why they did that. I do have I have a friend with some minor sources who said Theo wasn't interviewing well with some teams. So I don't know if that's with the Raptors, but that could be something.
And as much as, we can project and talk about players without having access to, these detailed scouting reports and also in-person workouts and interviews. Like, you can project quite a bit, but you're not there to see it, so you have to work with kind of incomplete information. So the Raptors play their cards very close to their vest, and Malachi Flynn was not projected to be the pick for the Toronto Raptors by, I think, anybody. So, but now that it has happened, you can definitely see why they did it. As you mentioned, the pick and roll, that's very important for the Toronto Raptors. That's the system that the Toronto Raptors run, very pick and roll heavy, less one-on-one stuff with the guards, although that does happen. They're probably looking for a guy who can come in off the bench, run the offense, and that means, having skill in the pick and roll.
Yeah, for sure. Last year, the Raptors, only Kyle Lowry was really our pick and roll handler, in terms of being good at it. Fred did it a fair bit, but in the playoffs, he really fell off, and he just wasn't good at it. In terms of, he couldn't really finish out of the pick and roll, and his passing is not what you want coming out of the pick and roll. And he's not really a pull-up shooter either, so he's pretty limited in effectiveness there. So I can see why the Raptors would have want another guard who was actually really good at it. Flynn might be the best pick and roll player in the draft. I don't know if he'll be the best going forward in the NBA, but he was one of the best in college.
I was reading that in the Athletic article after the Toronto Raptors drafted him by Blake Murphy, great writer, but he mentioned that Malachi Flynn was electric in the pick and roll. He was very deft at all the different elements because there's a lot of different ways to play the pick and roll. And if you're only good at one element of it, other teams are just going to take that away from you. So if you can shoot, if you can drive, if you can find guys, and you can do all of those things consistently, you're going to be a very dangerous guard in the pick and roll. So I think that that's definitely something that the Toronto Raptors value, especially after seeing this pick.
Yeah, for sure, because it was a weakness last year.
His offense we've spoken a little bit about. Maybe we can talk about his shooting, because that's an impressive facet of his game. Statistically, he has been a solid shooter, and he has potential as a guy that can shoot off of the dribble, and he has potential as a guy who is a catch-and-shoot player. Maybe he can play a little bit off of the ball, which would be helpful if he's going to be playing with Lowry and Van Vliet.
Yeah, for sure. Flynn, if you look at his shooting profile, he's pretty versatile as a shooter. So he shot a bit off ball, he shot a bit off screens. He took those pull-ups, like I mentioned earlier, in the pick and roll. So he's someone that might be able to play next to either Kyle or Fred, which is something that the Raptors like to do, is run these dual ball handler lineups. In terms of shooting, Flynn is like a really good shooter. He has a great form. It's very consistent. And he's versatile in that you can use him in a variety of situations as a shooter. We already mentioned him pulling up off the dribble in the pick and roll, but if you play him next to another ball handler like Fred or Kyle, he's a really good catch and shoot shooter. Sometimes he might be bothered by like a long-armed contest or something like that. But if you look at his stats for catch and shoot, he was excellent. And besides that, he's pretty versatile. You can run him off screens, which they did in San Diego State. You can have him shoot off handoffs and stuff. But it was pretty low volume.
Yeah, lots of different types of shooting, because obviously versatility, when you're coming off of the bench and you're working with veterans, you want to be able to contribute any way you can. So we've discussed his pick and roll acumen, we've discussed his shooting. Maybe we can talk about his defense, because that was another lauded element of his game.
Yeah, for sure. When you look at defense, you can really see Flynn's IQ, because he's obviously not the biggest guy, nor is he the longest, but he's very smart. And the way that he wins on defense is that he has nice feet and good hands. So usually he's able to defeat offensive players and get to spots first. And he's great at team defense, so he's good at making rotations or jumping passing lanes and getting steals. He's overall a very disciplined defender who knows what he's doing on that end, and he's always willing to give an effort.
Right, and when you're discussing defense, that's where a lot of basketball IQ, I believe, shows up. And most of that is because obviously you have to know the scheme, but you also have to make on-the-fly decisions where, if there's a breakdown, you have to know kind of which guy you have to rotate out to, how to cover a guy immediately. Just if you switch out onto somebody, you have to know immediately what their preferences are.
Especially on the Raptors, where they demand a lot.
Right, they demand a lot, not only in terms of knowing the schemes, but also they switch as much as any team in the league. So you have to be smart enough. You have to read that scouting report, know exactly what the preferences are for like maybe 3 different guys that you'd have to switch out onto, maybe even more, So that's one thing, that you have to have that baseline basketball IQ that I think the Raptors are definitely looking for at this stage. And
Nurse won't play you.
Right, Nurse will not play you unless... We saw that with Terrence Davis. I mean...
Yeah.
We could go into a whole podcast about Terrence Davis, but one of the reasons that he didn't see as much playing time as I think a lot of people wanted him to was because his defense needed work, and his basketball IQ on that end was not at the level that I think Nick Nurse demanded. And that is why I think Patrick McCaw, as much as, I don't really think that he's an amazing player.
He's not a fan favorite for sure.
No, but he knew the schemes, and he, tried to execute them to the best of his abilities. And that, I think, carries a lot of weight for Nick Nurse, is that, do you know the schemes? Are you willing to execute them? Do you have a high enough basketball intelligence in order to make that happen? And another thing that we mentioned is the quickness of Malachi Flynn. So in order, not just knowing the schemes, but also having the physical capabilities to enact them. So can you get out to that guy? Can you close out on that player and harry their shot, make sure that they're not taking an open jump shot? That's important as well. But I think that feeds into the next part, are the weaknesses. And I think that the biggest weakness for me, I'm not looking at age, because I know that the Toronto Raptors, they don't care about that. And as I get, more in tune with how the Raptors pick, I'm kind of the same way. I'm not looking at a guy's age that much, especially at number 29. What I'm looking at is kind of his physical attributes. So he's a shorter guard. 6'1" might be a little generous. They give guys an inch to, stay away from the dreaded 5'11" designation.
How tall are you, Private? Sir, 5'9", sir! 5'9". I didn't know they stacked shit that high. You trying to squeeze an inch in on me somewhere, huh?
You don't want that.
And also, he's not, he's not physically imposing. He's not a very particularly strong guy. He's not a guy player's not gonna physically.
You talked about the Raptors defense. Yeah. So having a guy who's not physically really able to compete with bigger players, with all the switching, or someone who's smaller without long arms, with all the quick closeouts, that could be a disadvantage.
Right. So maybe he's able to get to a guy in time, but he's not long enough to really bother their shot.
Yep. And then Kevin Durant or Jason Tatum just shoot over him. Or,
if there's still time left on the clock, you get that rotation. He's out on an island against a guy who's got like almost a foot on him and has the triple threat ability. It's not going to be a very pleasant experience. Whereas, Kyle Lowry, as you mentioned, future Hall of Famer in my opinion, there's nobody in the league that really has a huge advantage against him, because he is first of all, he's the craftiest guy in the entire league. If you try and bully him, he takes a charge. If you put the ball down, he gets a hand in there and knocks it away. If you try and back him down, he's like
he's too strong.
Immovable object, with the Kyle Lowry is famous, the booty. But that's not something you're going to expect from Malachi Flynn. He's kind of a smaller guy. He's a guy that the defensive end, he may be maybe not a bad defender, but let's say a limited defender. Would you say that that's an accurate assessment?
Yeah, I think compared to Kyle or Fred, really his biggest disadvantage is that he's not built like a fire hydrant like those two. His build is more in line with like a Steph Curry or something like that. He's a pretty average guard in terms of build, so I don't think he'll be able to reach the defensive versatility of those two. He might still be a above average defender just by being in the right place all the time, and he's good at navigating screens. I don't know what the best pick and roll defense options will have, but it's usually important to be able to do that. So I think he could end up a good defender. I don't know if he can end up an elite one like Kyle or Fred, but I think settling for good is still okay.
Right. And at 29, you're not looking for, we're talking about perhaps a guy who could be a backup point guard, a backup guard for the Toronto Raptors well into the future. And also at number 29, cost controlled. If this guy can contribute at an NBA level for 15 minutes off of the bench and looks okay, that is a huge bargain that the Toronto Raptors have on their hands, just because of the nature of how the rookie scale contract works and how restricted free agency works with a younger player. It's just a huge value option for the Raptors. So it is so hard to bet against the Toronto Raptors front office. If they pick a guy, you almost have to respect their ability to play in the NBA. Okay, so that is Malachi Flynn, and I think that that's a good, overall view of what you can expect from him, all the information that we have available right now.
I did want to mention one more thing with him, just in terms of weaknesses, is that he didn't really get to the basket a lot in college, which is the one thing I don't like about him as a pick, because that was a weakness for the Raptors last year, is really Kyle could only get to the rim, and Flynn doesn't really help there because he didn't do that in college either, so it's unlikely he'll do that in the NBA.
That is a good thing to point out, is that the Raptors have a problem with that. Okay, so let's talk about the Toronto Raptors' 59th pick. Usually, for most teams, I would assume, and also for the Raptors prior to Masai Ujiri's tenure as the GM, the second round is just a wasteland. I mean, the second round of the draft, unlike other sports, has very few hits. And if you do hit there, you're usually talking about guys who are just have a cup of coffee in the league, maybe ride the bench for a couple of teams, and then, go to Europe or find other employment. But with the Raptors, the second round has been fruitful for them. They've gotten guys, Norman Powell, but I'm going to include undrafted as well, just because it's a similar situation. Because they're able to find guys that other teams overlook, we should not discount Jalen Harris. I think we should sort of examine him as a prospect. Maybe you can give us a bit of a background as to who he is. Scoring guard, 6'5", decent measurements, but what's a more in-depth look at him? What could you say about him?
I think Jalen Harris is actually really like this pick, because one of the fan favorites that we've seen for the Raptors for the draft was Grant Riller. And Jalen Harris is pretty similar as an archetype. He's just a pure bucket getter, as they say. Mm-hmm. So he's 6'5". He's about the size of a normal guard, I think. But he's
guard, right?
Yeah, he's a combo guard. He's pretty above average as an athlete. He's got a good handle. He's one of the better shot makers in this class. You'll see scoring out of ISO or pick and roll. He's a 3-level scorer is what you want. We just talked about one of the weaknesses of the Raptors was someone to get into the rim and who could score there. Mm-hmm. Harris did that really well in college. So maybe in a couple of years he could be that guy for them. Mm-hmm. Defensively, he is, unfortunately, fits the stereotype of every six man where he's not good.
Right.
But
so we're looking at a one-way player, essentially.
Yeah, he's a one-way player. So maybe he gets better defensively when he has less of a role, because in college he was the offense, but in the NBA he'll be part of the offense instead. So maybe more energy will be useful for him.
Obviously, that's something that he can work on. Would you say that perhaps Jalen Harris is 905 bound?
Yeah, I don't really see a role for him just as a rookie. Maybe if he can outplay Paul Watson, who is another guy in a similar mold, he might be able to get some end of the bench minutes, but he's probably 905 bound for his first year.
Right.
Which is normal for Raptors draftees.
Paul Watson is a guy that could very well see Toronto Raptors time and perhaps even significant minutes on the Raptors squad.
He's a classic Raptors dunker too.
Yeah, he's an exciting...
If you haven't already, people listening, they need to pull up Paul Watson dunk highlights because it's so much fun.
Yeah, he's a guy that, again, went to the Raptors 905 and looks the better for it. So I think that, as you were saying, maybe that's the path for Jalen Harris. Put him on the farm team, develop him, kind of see what he can do, and then bounce him between the main squad and the 905, depending on how he's playing. So is that kind of something that you see for him in his future here in Toronto?
Yeah, that's his most likely path, is at least spending his first year mostly in the G League. We've seen this be really beneficial for guys like Siakam or Fred, and even Norman Powell.
Yeah, absolutely. So you were saying that you were high on him pre-draft?
I had him ranked higher than they ended up drafting him. I had him somewhere in the 40s. So I really like this pick. I think with our development system, he's not hopeless as a defender. I think you can get something good out of him there. And I think his scoring skill set, just with a little more refinement, could be really useful in the NBA.
Offensive upside, perhaps. We're looking at a sixth man type player who can come off the bench and sort of be a microwave, heat things up, and then, light up the opposing team's second unit and then go back to the bench.
That's definitely the mold for him, because unlike Flynn, he wasn't really good off ball. Like, he didn't shoot well in catch and shoot, and he didn't really perform many off ball actions. So you want him with the ball in his hands, because he's not really giving you value besides that. So you're hoping he can be that guy who can lead a bench unit in scoring and just kind of manufacture buckets against benches.
That's an important skill. I mean, that's an important role on a team, is that your starting unit is kind of like a machine with all of these different moving parts that have to interact with one another and be completely, harmonious. Whereas in the second unit, you're kind of looking for a guy with one big skill set. Like, if you have a rebounder on the bench, that's a guy, if you're getting killed on the boards, you bring that guy in, you can shore up that weakness. A sixth man is pretty well-known position in the NBA at this point, which is that you need a guy who can score the ball when the starters are off the floor. And at number 59 in the draft, if you get a guy that, has that kind of potential, that's not a bad pick. So...
For sure. Yeah, and that's something that the Raptors kind of struggled with last year, is that they put Norman Powell in that role, but Norman Powell doesn't really have the creation chops to be a sixth man, because he's not really creating for others. So you saw him benefit off being off ball himself. So I think if you have someone that can be a little more ball dominant off the bench, it would actually be beneficial for the Raptors.
That's true. Norm Powell has a lot of very good points in favor of him, but one of his big weaknesses is that ability to create. And he took let's not completely discredit him, because he did take a very big jump from 2 years ago to this past season in his ability to put the ball on the floor. He looked like a completely different player. Whereas 2 years ago, he was, dribbling into three players and turning the ball over. Last season, he was making those quick, short, straight line drives to the basket when he felt like he could get past his man and, being able to shoot the ball. He has a lot of good qualities. He can also play a bit of defense too. So this isn't discrediting him. But like you said, in the sixth man role, you got to have the ability to just kind of like get in there, get the ball up, shoot the ball. Like, shot creation is almost as important as shot making. So that's something maybe we can look forward to with Jalen Harris.
Yeah, they have different skill sets. I'd say Norm is more of a play finisher, while Harris mainly creates for himself, but he has a little bit of a pick and roll game, and he's an okay passer, which is something that's one of Norm's weaknesses. The other thing is that I'm doubtful that Norman Powell will be still on the team after next season. So either way, having someone maybe in the back being developed for that role could be useful. Absolutely.
And I've predicted it. I mean, I'm not going to take credit for it if it happens, just because I think a lot of people have. But as the Toronto Raptors' most tradable piece, and just how free agency looks in 2021, and the uncertainty about his player option, I think that it might be time. It might even happen by the time this video comes out, but I think that this might be the end of his tenure here with the Raptors. All right, Raptors fans, I want to thank you for listening to yet another draft podcast with my guest, Sam. Thank you again. Again, if you're listening to this, follow Sam on Twitter at HoopGoose. He is one of the best guys on Twitter, gives a lot of really good information and lots of entertaining tweets, so follow him. And follow me as well. I like to think that my posts are pretty entertaining, so follow me at Raptors Report. But other than that, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it gave you a little bit more information on what the Raptors are working with in terms of their draft picks. Please drop a like and a subscribe. It really helps the channel out. And thank you for listening to Raptors Report, your source for in-depth Raptors content.